Madam Recording Secretary, let's begin the meeting.
Recording in progress.
Yes, Chair Vega, the meeting's being recorded.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I would like to call the August 8th, 2024 Santa Ana Police Oversight Commission regular meeting to order. The time is 5:18 p.m. This meeting is taking place with in-person attendance at the City Council chamber. The public can also watch the meeting online via the Santa Ana YouTube channel or the city's website. Madam Recording Secretary, can you please conduct a roll call?
Thank you, Chair Vega. Commissioner Castillo-Latin.
Here.
Commissioner Goransky. Commissioner Mejia. Noting for the record, Commissioner Mejia is absent. Commissioner Perea.
Present.
Commissioner Said.
Here, thank you.
Vice Chair Carpenter.
Here.
Chair Vega.
Here.
6 members present. You have quorum.
Thank you. Commissioner Castillo-Latson, will you do us the honors and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I will.
Thank you, Commissioner. We now move on to public comments. Now is the time for the Commission to receive comments from the public on agenda and non-agenda items pursuant to the Brown Act. The Commission may not enter into discussion at this time. Speakers will have 3 minutes for their comments. Madam Recording Secretary, is there anyone that wishes to speak in person?
Chair Vega, we do not have any speakers for this meeting.
Thank you. Moving on to the consent calendar, item 1 is the regular meeting minutes of July 11th, 2024. The recommended action is to approve the minutes. Would any commissioner like to make a motion to approve the minutes of that meeting?
I'll make a motion to approve them.
I'll second.
Motioned by Commissioner Goransky, seconded by Vice Chair Carpenter. Madam Recording Secretary, can you please conduct a roll call?
Motion to approve the minutes moved by Commissioner Goransky, seconded by Vice Chair Carpenter. Commissioner Castillo-Latin.
Yes.
Commissioner Goransky.
Yes.
Commissioner Mejia. Noting for the record, Commissioner Mejia is absent. Commissioner Perea.
Yes.
Commissioner Said.
Yes, thank you.
Vice Chair Carpenter.
Yes.
Chair Vega.
Yes.
Motion carries to approve the recommended action.
Great, thank you. That's the end of the consent calendar. Now we move on to work study session. The only item is training on implicit bias and civilian oversight presented by Dr. Barr.
Okay, I'm sorry for butting in, please excuse me. Before we begin, can I make a statement?
Sure, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, usually you call for something from the dais. Being the climate that we have in the world today, especially in this country, is it possible for us to have an officer sit out there in the lobby like they used to do and watch who comes in here after our meetings get started? Last month while we were here, 3 people were out there back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, looking in the windows, back and forth, circling around, looking in the windows, till finally there were 3 out there. And after a while, about after 15 minutes, they came in and they sat down there. But you don't see it, but we're looking here, we can see what's going on out there. And I know we used to have an officer that sat out there, a uniformed officer for a while, and we haven't for a long time. And I'd like to ask, could we have that again for all of our safety?
Thank you for your comments. I'll definitely take a look into that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. You all agree? Up here? Okay, because you can't trust anybody these days, especially when you're in public meetings or any type of a meeting these days. Somebody comes in and starts shooting, and we certainly don't need that here. Okay, thank you.
Well, are we giving, just for clarity, are we giving direction to if we need?
Yeah, I don't know, is that supposed to be like an item that needs to be on the agenda and then vote on it for something like that?
are we voting on an item that's not on the agenda? We cannot do that. So if it's something that Commissioner would like to make during Commissioner comment period, maybe repeat what you just indicated during comments and a request to place something on the agenda for further vote and action, we can certainly do that.
Out of curiosity, well, I don't know if I can ask this now, but do other commissioners, do they have a dedicated police officer outside? I know for city council, but what about other commissions?
I am not aware of an officer being assigned specifically to a particular commission. Whether or not one has been requested and provided, I'm not aware.
Okay,
I can comment. I've been on 2 commissions. We did not have a police officer present.
okay, so no direction given, but maybe you can restate that in your closing comments, Commissioner. Dr. Tina Barr?
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me back here on night 2, and I did have a good time with you all last night, and hope that you gained something from it, and similarly hope that you gained something from this training tonight. It is on biases, particularly implicit bias, and I think you all have the handouts in front of you, so you can follow along. Do I need to let that person in? Okay. Okay, so here's the overview for the next hour or so. I'm going to provide an overview of cognitive bias and then look specifically at some types of implicit bias, and then going to focus on what might be helpful for you all as commissioners as you're doing the work that you are doing as a part of this Police Oversight Commission, and going to use a case study to do that. So after going over the first couple of sections, we're going to try to look at a case and apply what I've covered. So to start off, an overview of cognitive bias. I wanted to make sure that we're on the same page with understanding some of the basics about bias. So on this slide, you'll see 3 definitions. The first one, I don't know if I can read the entire thing, but an inclination or preference that especially interferes with impartial judgment. And so it is a straightforward definition. There's no judgment. There's no good or bad about that. It is what it is, a bias. A cognitive bias is specifically dealing with a bias related to cognition or how we think, okay? So key word in that definition is unconscious. Unconscious drivers that influence our judgments and decision-making. So when we get to the third definition, implicit bias, that speaks more about any bias, good or bad, related to people or groups of people, okay? Cognitive bias, the second definition in general, just speaks more about the process that our brain goes through in processing information. Implicit bias was created specifically when referring to people and groups of people. So the definition there, the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So again, you see that word unconscious, which is key. Activated involuntarily, without awareness or intentional control. This can be either positive or negative, and everyone is susceptible. I'm going to show you a series of a few. Yes.
A quick question, your notations there, Ethics and Compliance Initiative, Lieberman, Rock and Company. Can you give us a little background on what those are? Are those studies or?
Some of them are studies. Lieberman, Rock and Company, and Co., yes, are studies. And so I can provide the list of resources that I'm using on this slide, on this presentation for tonight.
All right, thank you.
But like the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, of course, it's not a study, but it is an organization that exists with expertise in ethics. Kirin Institute actually is an institute that focuses on race and ethnicity studies. So it's comprised of researchers and people with expertise in bias, race, ethnicity, anything related to that. The key thing to remember, you're welcome, the key thing to remember when talking about these different types or these definitions, implicit bias refers to individuals, groups, and it is a type of a cognitive bias. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures. And if you can just look at the screen, I'm going to go through each one pretty quickly. All right? I'm going to show it. I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to ask you until you see it. Are you ready? Play along with me. What did you see?
A stove, the burners, it looked like to me.
A stove burner. You are correct in that. What did you think of, or what do you think of when you see an image like that?
You're gonna cook.
Food.
Yep.
Cook, food,
Get burned.
get burnt. It can vary by person to person. Some of you had the same thought. When I initially saw that, I thought burn, like don't touch the hot stove, okay? Next image. What was that?
It's a rattlesnake.
A rattlesnake. You caught the rattle quickly. What do you think of when you hear or see rattlesnake?
I think it's cool. I like to see them. I love to see them in the wild.
Does everyone else have that same idea when they first see it?
Same here.
You too, okay. Did
I
anyone?
think stay away. Go around.
Okay. So again, a couple people think it's really cool. Some people think, oh, no,
Danger.
not going near there.
Yeah.
When I saw it, I thought danger. I grew up Southeast Virginia. We have rattlesnakes, we have copperheads, and we learn very early which are the dangerous snakes and which to stay away from, all right? So the point of this exercise is you saw something, it wasn't even a second that each of those pictures were up. But you automatically had an impression on what you saw. Where did those impressions come from? Why did you think, ooh, cool, I want to see it, in some cases, and why did you think, I'm staying away from that?
Well, I enjoy nature for one thing, and I think you don't get to see them every day. And when you get to see them in the wild, it's interesting to me. You know, how do you get over fear? By understanding what you're looking at. So,
Have you always enjoyed nature from the time you were young all the
Yeah.
way up?
Yeah.
Okay. And so did someone teach you about snakes and nature and trees or?
not really, no. It's just, you know, like people have a fear of spiders, but if you really kind of take the time to understand them, then they're not so, you know, I hate to use the word scary because I think it's overused in today's world. So no, I think, you know, if you understand what the animal is all about, and that applies to people too, you know, it takes away some of that prejudice or bias or whatever you want to call it. So, yeah,
All right. So, yep, once you learn more about it,
correct.
they're not as scary, they're not as unusual, you're informed about them.
They're
Okay?
interesting.
Good point. Did you have a different comment that you wanted to make, or you were?
Oh, my guess was that's cognitive bias.
It is exactly an examples of cognitive bias. Now, going back to that stove, some of you thought cook. You thought get burnt, right? So a common lesson that we all learn as children, stay away from hot irons, hot stove, hot combs, whatever it might be. So we all usually learn at an early age that if you touch something that's hot, you can get burned, it can hurt, you can be injured, right? So those are some of the shared lessons that many people, learn as a young person. All right, so I'm going to show a third picture really quickly. Any
UFC fighter.
a fighter, okay? So here's where we start getting into some trickier or murkier territory, right? Because when we start to use our biases, which are neither good nor bad, everyone has them, it is inherent, it is a human thing, and it is a normal neurological process to develop and form biases. Don't think of it in terms of good or bad, all right? So when we get to our biases about people and groups of people, everything that you mentioned about why you learned or how you feel about snakes, cool, interesting, and I like the point you made. You learned about them. So once you know about them, you're no longer afraid of them or scared of them. So think of those comments and some of the reasonings about how you formed an opinion or your perception about some of these images as we go along for the rest of the hour or so. But when we get to people, this is where it's tricky, because some of you express some different ideas and impressions about the burner, about the snake. There are going to be lots of impressions, ideas, beliefs based on our own backgrounds, experiences, religion, cultures, all of those things that informed our split-second ideas and impressions about human beings. Okay. So I am going to attempt to get out of this quickly to show you a very short video related to what we're talking about.
Our brain is a true miracle. Every day, it masters a myriad of tasks in the shortest of time and is quite challenged in the process. Neuroscience tells us that at any moment, approximately 11 million pieces of information are raining down on our brain. Only a fraction of about 40 pieces of information is processed, and of that, only a small part is processed consciously. To deal with this flood of information, our brain has to filter and simplify the information received, so it creates numerous patterns. Information that reaches our brain is constantly compared and labeled within milliseconds, long before we even consciously deal with it. Recognizing patterns is a key feature of our brain and allows it to work very efficiently. As a result, we're able to make vital decisions within just split seconds. If a new piece of information is, "A lion is approaching," we don't have to think for long and know immediately what to do. In the course of time, our brain created many such patterns that support us when thinking, just like templates to compare new pieces of information with old ones. Various factors influence the kinds of patterns. Our upbringing, for example. What did we learn early on about certain people? Or the media. How do the media report on certain topics? Our work. What does our work environment look like, and what are we dealing with on a daily basis? And of course, the wide range of our own experiences. What personal experiences do we have, and how did we feel when we made them? The system of rapid, exemplary association is what enables our thinking in the first place. What if, however, our brain falls back on the wrong comparisons? For example, when we meet someone for the first time, our brain immediately creates an image, the first impression. We then access existing information. That can be positive or negative experiences, images portrayed by the media, or pieces of information we just received recently. We hardly know anything about this person, but already we're labeling them. This way, it may happen that we may not invite a person with a different skin color to a job interview because we generally don't think they're competent enough. Or that yet another man receives the promotion because our brain learned that leadership skills are male. There are more male managers as exemplary patterns after all. This is the principle of unconscious biases, and it influences our thinking every day.
Unconscious biases are those impressions that
Okay, so that little video, I like it. It's a simple explanation for a complex process that our brain goes through. But essentially, it reiterates the point that biases are neither good nor bad. Everyone has biases, and it's a way, in some cases, to keep us safe. For example, the hot stove, the snake. We are not even thinking about it. We automatically have a reaction to it because of what we have learned throughout our life when we see things like that. When it comes to people, as I said, that's where things can get a little trickier. And thinking of yourselves as commissioners and that work that you're going to do, you should always have biases in the forefront of your mind, because in order to prevent the biases that we all have from interfering in the work that you're going to be doing, you have to be aware of them and acknowledge that you have them and intentionally try to let them not interfere with the work that you're going to be doing. I'm going to use myself as an example. I was a professor. I taught on biases, race, ethnicity. I am a woman of color, grew up primarily in the South, and so I have a lot of life experiences. But that last image that I showed after the snake and the burner, I wanted to show a human being, okay? Because I wanted to point out, yes, there are certain things that are easier to talk about. The work that you're going to be doing, you're going to be reviewing actual cases of completed investigations, okay? So you're going to be dealing with human beings on paper, because you're not going to be investigating, but you're going to be reviewing. But the same kind of process applies, whether you're sitting in front of somebody, interviewing them as an investigator, which I know your director will have the ability to do, or you're reviewing a case. So for the rest of the night, I want to focus on what your role is going to be as far as reviewing cases, okay? Examples about myself. About 30 years ago, I think it was I in college back then? Over 30 years ago, when I was a young college student, one of the things that one of my college professors asked me, called me in after class or at the end of class, and asked me, "Are you really the one who is rewriting these papers?" And at the time, when I had that conversation, or she pulled me into the, at the end of class and asked to speak, didn't even think about it. I was confused. I thought, let her know, of course, yeah. She said, "How are you doing this?" And my response was, "Well, you give me feedback on my rough draft, and so I take the feedback and I rewrite the paper." Never thought about it until many years later. Fast forward 10 or so years. Is that right? Yep, 10 or so years. So I was working in a nonprofit agency, and the executive director of the agency, I had been there probably a few months, had a few interactions with the director, and ended up doing something where, at like a staff-wide retreat, like training on something, facilitating something. Afterwards, the executive director came up to me and in all seriousness said, "You're smarter than you look." Okay? Fast forward, this is actually a couple years ago when I was a professor. Don't even remember what class I was teaching, but one of the things I like to do at the end of a semester is get feedback on how the semester went. How did the teaching go? What did students learn? One of the questions I like to ask students, is there anything that you learned that was surprising to you? I'm thinking about content of the course. One of the responses from one of the students was, "I was surprised to learn how smart you are." Now, why people have certain impressions of me, these three individuals in these cases, I can make educated guesses. I know the research. I study this type of stuff. Whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's the accent. Sometimes people notice a little southern accent here. But whatever it is, people automatically form impressions, right? That is bias. And again, these situations I just described could be viewed negatively. I've learned not to take things personally, but it's not always bad, right? Protective factors, self-preservation, also having biases, because of, as you saw in the video, we get thousands and thousands of information every single second. Our brain has to develop a way to make order and organization and make sense of everything that we are bombarded with every single second. So those split-second automatic ways of thinking, those biases, help us to navigate on a day-to-day basis and make sense of the world we're living in. Imagine if we had to stop and think about every single thing that we're doing. We would never get through the day, ever. Okay, so the video that you saw, that processing, making sense of the information that we're getting bombarded with on a regular basis, And then that process is often also referred to as System 1 thinking, okay? So here's the definition of System 1 thinking: the intuitive and preconscious thinking people engage in most of the time. We drive automobiles, navigate the grocery store, and communicate with others in an automatic way. In doing so, we are making thousands of tiny judgments automatically. The trade-off for the speed and efficiency of these mental shortcuts, however, is an increased tendency to make mental errors, okay? So preconscious, intuitive. How many people, by show of hands in here, know how to drive a car? All right. When you're driving, do you think about every single thing that you're doing? Or is it just kind of second nature at this point? If you've been driving a long time, you're not sitting back thinking about every single thing you do, right? If you use your turn signal, it's kind of automatic. If you're backing up, it's automatic. You're not thinking, wait, I need to stop, I need to adjust this mirror, I need to do this. It becomes automatic. However, if you think back, if you can remember to when you first started driving, what that experience was like. Hyper alert, scared, nervous, just super vigilant about everything going on around you. Show of hands, how many people play a sport or have played a sport ever in your life on a team sport, okay? So for anybody who's ever done that, the more you play, it's second nature. You are not even thinking about the plays or what to do. It becomes automatic, right? You know the plays. If you played baseball or softball, you know if the ball is hit to left field and you're manning a base, you know what's going to happen. You know where you should throw the ball. You know whether or not instinctually if you can round that base and make it to third if you're rounding second, right? All of that becomes second nature. Again, imagine if you had to consciously think about every single thing you're doing while you're playing a sport. You would never get through the game. It just wouldn't work. Okay? So a few key ideas about implicit biases. And remember, this goes to speaking primarily about people and groups of people when we think about implicit biases, which are a part or a type of cognitive bias. Implicit biases are attitudes or stereotypes that unconsciously affect our actions, decisions, and understanding. Keyword, I will re-emphasize it, repetition is good, unconscious. They can be positive or negative. They're different from known biases that people may choose to conceal. As a matter of fact, implicit biases often conflict with a person's declared beliefs. Because we're not thinking about the biases, they're automatic. Oftentimes, people believe that they may be one way, when in actuality, their implicit thoughts, their actions are more aligned with the actual bias about whatever it is, the person, the idea, the subject. Implicit biases are formed over a lifetime as a result of exposure to direct and indirect messages. So you talked about some of this a little bit earlier about the snakes, the stove, but they can be more than just the messages you receive from growing up, from your parents, from your family members. They could be messages you've received from schools, from the media, constant messages, all right? Just any type of messages you're receiving on a day-to-day basis is, again, thousands of pieces of information coming at you every second of the day. Implicit biases are pervasive, and that simply means that everyone has them. Nobody on this planet is exempt from having biases. And then finally, implicit biases are changeable or malleable. So although we all have them, and some are protective, as we talked about, they're also changeable. So if you become aware of any biases that may negatively impact what you're doing on a day-to-day in your role as commissioners, the good thing is that they can change, okay? You're not stuck with biases forever. However, in order to change them, that does require being intentional, taking the time and effort to make the change, and also receiving education, training in order to be knowledgeable about what it is that you have the bias about. All right, the types of implicit bias. There are lots of different types of implicit bias, and so was thinking of what is the most helpful to you, that might be the most helpful to you as you're doing your work, as you're sitting on this commission. So the first couple of slides are implicit bias, and the next two after these two are more general cognitive biases. Affinity bias, or the like me bias. This is when there's a tendency, we all have it, to favor information received from individuals who are similar to us, who are like us. And this can be based on a variety of demographic characteristics. It can be based on sharing the same religion with somebody, sharing the same race or ethnicity, sharing the same gender, socioeconomic status, geographic location, the neighborhood you live in, right? There is a general tendency, they're like me. Cognitive bias, I can trust them more. I can believe more in what they're saying, right? We probably have more in common, okay? So that's the affinity or like me bias. Now the halo effect and the horn effect kind of go with the image of an angel and a devil. The halo effect is a tendency to allow a specific trait or our overall impression of a person to positively influence our judgment of them overall. So there may be something that we like, a specific trait that we like about a person. We might like the neighborhood that they live in. We might like their profession, a teacher, right? A social worker, a firefighter. We might like something about them that influences our overall perception about who they are as a person. Man, they've got to be a good person. They teach those young children all day long. They're a great person, okay? Conversely, the horns effect is allowing a specific trait that you recognize about somebody to influence in a negative way the way we see them or judge them overall, right? So it can be some of those same characteristics, socioeconomic status, their profession. It could be someone has a lot of tattoos, they can have piercings. It could be the language they're using. So something about them is noticed, and it influences our judgment of them overall, okay? Confirmation bias, okay? This is when there's a tendency to give more weight to information that tends to confirm one's preconceived notions, or conversely, to give less value to information or evidence that contradicts an existing belief. So when we think about this in terms of people, this is apparent when we make a judgment about a person and then subconsciously favor information that supports that judgment. So going back to the teacher, if I meet someone who's a teacher and I automatically think, wow, they got to be a great person. Teachers, a good profession, they're teaching young people, they're doing a lot of good in this world. But then I realized, they might have done something that was questionable, right? And even though that information might exist, right? If I discard it, it doesn't support my idea of that person as a good teacher, that teacher as a good person. So if it doesn't fit that idea that they're a good person, I just kind of brush that information aside. I willfully ignore it because it doesn't fit my idea of who they are. Okay? Availability bias and expediency bias. So the availability bias isn't necessarily an implicit bias, and neither is the expediency bias. However, they are biases that can affect the work that you're going to be doing. And I'm thinking more so when you start reviewing cases. Availability bias is the tendency to make decisions based on information that is most readily available. So there could be information that might be helpful to something that you're doing, reviewing a case, but you might not feel like you can ask for the information, or you might not have time, right? Say there's a deadline that you have to review a file or a case that you've received. You're just going to go with the information that you have rather than seek out more information or take the time to obtain it, okay? Expediency bias, the tendency to form an opinion or a conclusion without considering all available information. So both of these can be influenced by deadlines, but also external pressures. I've never sat on an oversight commission like you all are sitting on, right? But I imagine in some cases, there might be someone who sits on a board, a commission, a panel throughout the country that might feel a little external pressure to come to a conclusion about a case they're reviewing because they don't want to upset somebody. Yesterday, I said if you're doing the job effectively, at all times, someone is not going to be happy with something that you're doing, right? So if you're looking at information and you don't want to upset anybody, you could make a decision because of external pressures. Okay? And the time frame or time factor is a reality. And the desire to please is a human desire, right? Culturally, for some of us more than others, but it is a human desire, and so that could be something that is a factor that you want to keep in the forefront of your mind as well when you're carrying out your responsibilities on the commission. I'm not even gonna go to the YouTube videos. I had a little short clips on each of these, but I don't want to risk it. Priming and anchoring are other types of cognitive biases as well. So priming, as you can see, a phenomenon in which our reactions to something or someone is affected by our exposure to something else. So when I think of this, a common example is when I think of how information is presented by different media outlets, right? One media outlet may use a particular language to describe an event. Another media outlet may use different language. So I think I often go back to Hurricane Katrina a few years ago, and the way the media portrayed, in some cases, what was referred to as looting the stores. And in other cases, other media referred to these instances as people found supplies or water or toilet paper, whatever it was they needed. So this is more, there were lots of media reporting. Of course, the entire country was reporting on this. But in some cases, it was framed as people found what they needed to survive, right? Wasn't the best case scenario, but people were desperate and they needed things to survive, water, some of the basic essentials. Other ways of reporting the information were people looted stores. Now, oftentimes, this was the same scenario, just reported in very different ways. The reality is also the people who were, I'm using air quotes, looting or finding things, there was some bias there, depending on who the people were. Okay. Anchoring is a tendency to rely heavily on the first piece of information we are given, see, or hear about an individual or an event. That cannot be understated. The first information you get about an event, maybe you've got a case file and you read whatever the first report is at the top of the stack. That information in that report can color or influence the way you read the rest of the file, okay? And again, it can go back to language. It can go back to how something is presented. All of the biases, the implicit biases, the cognitive biases that I have gone over, there are tons and tons of research that have confirmed, looked at, examined, replicated studies on all of these types of biases, okay? So they're pretty common, they're not controversial. They're psychological, neurobiological studies that speak to all of these. All right, so conducting reviews with implicit bias in mind. Reviewing completed investigations are going to be a big part of what you do as commissioners. And so I wanted to take a moment. You all have a case study in front of you. It's the Johnson case study. Okay. I'm gonna pull it up. Give me one moment. Okay. So those of you who are in the room with me, you've got a copy of this in front of you. So if you would just take a few moments and read through this one pager, and then afterwards, I'm just going to ask you some areas where there might be potential bias or to be aware of bias when you're looking at or reviewing a closed investigation. This is not a real case. Okay, so what I want to ask you right now is not what are your biases, but thinking of this case and just thinking of some of the different types of biases that I went over, affinity bias, the halo effect, the horns effect, confirmation bias, availability or expediency, and then priming or anchoring. Does anything stand out to you, any type of those types of biases that someone, not you, but someone might employ if they're reviewing a case like this? And I can go first if no one else wants to.
All of them.
All of them. Would you like to be more specific?
Well, I mean, you could apply every one of them. You can apply the halo effect on either side of the scenario. You can apply the Horn effect on either side of the scenario. You can apply the implicit biases on both sides. I mean, you can apply every one of these to each side.
So what might an affinity bias look like?
I'm sorry?
What might an affinity bias look like if someone were reviewing this? Anyone?
Well, either side, you could say because he's black, because I'm black, they don't like me, right? The police have, you know, it's because I'm black. Cops can say, well, it's because I'm a cop.
Okay.
Right? You don't like me because I'm a cop, so that would just be something that would jump out at me right there.
Okay.
Speaking on the affinity bias, I think if you read this, it distinguishes race. So I guess one could say, you know, white female officer, white male officer. But I guess when I was reading it, and I don't know if I can share what I thought, but
Sure.
I guess I just want to know if there was body-worn footage because these stories are so drastically different.
Right.
And it resulted in an injury. So I guess I'm just missing what actually happened to result in the injury because I couldn't tell who's telling the truth from this report.
Right. So whether or not there's body-worn camera, I don't have an answer for that. So for purposes of just thinking of bias, right? But what you're doing is good because you're thinking about the available information, right? So the availability bias, that's a great question to have when thinking about that, because in some cases, there might be additional information, but if you don't request that information or ask, hey, was this obtained, you might not know. You might just go with, you have what's in front of you reviewing this case. I don't have time to request or even find out if there's any more information, and so that's the availability bias. I think you had your hand up and then over here.
Yeah, I'm wondering because for every actor in this example, there is description of the race and the gender, but there's no description of race and gender of the manager. And this is where I'm wondering around affinity bias, because I think with affinity bias is the tendency to favor information received from individuals who are like us. So I think I am strong to see where the information received by either side was happening, but I think the only exchange of information around like look like us could have been or could not been around the manager. So I think having that information would be important. I think that there has been, different stories of, for example, when, if I tell someone, hey, like, let's say my brother looks like me, similar experience, this happened, and he will just take the information as true.
Right.
So I'm kind of just wondering if that's something that can add to that situation. But actually, I was gonna also mention in regarding to the one that stood out very clearly to me was the horns effect regarding the interactions from both sides around what influence that could have influenced them negatively. I think that from the perspective of the black males, seeing the way that an officer, they immediately there's an immediate horn effect that takes place. Perhaps also similarly from the white police officers, I felt that was very, very intense present in this scenario.
Okay, before I comment, I'm going to get all comments from the commissioners. Commissioner Castillo?
He already commented on what I was going to say.
He stole your thunder. Okay, so good observations and good lines of thinking. Am I on? Yes, good lines of thinking. So affinity bias. If I'm a commissioner and I'm reviewing this case, and this is a made-up case, depending on what race and ethnicity I am, I may believe what the young people, these 20-year-old people who were arrested, or I may believe the officers, okay? There are some commissions and panels in this country where former law enforcement officers can serve on the commissions and boards. If I'm a former law enforcement officer and I'm reviewing this case, my affinity bias, because if I'm not consciously aware of that, I might unconsciously or subconsciously favor the police report here. If I'm African American and I'm sitting on the commission, if I'm not thinking of bias at the forefront when I'm reviewing these cases, I might subconsciously favor the account of the African American person who was involved in this case. Okay? As a female, right? There's a female officer involved who's the only female that's mentioned in this scenario. I might subconsciously favor what she's saying because I have that in common with her. So as you're reviewing cases, thinking of a case in that way, like what shared experiences, shared identities do you have with the individuals who are either the person who filed a complaint or the officers who are involved in that particular case, right? Consciously think about what it is that you have in common with everyone involved, the complainant and the subject officer or officers. If you're thinking about those things, that's the first step to prevent the subconscious cognitive biases from coming into play. If I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, I'm Asian, there are no Asian people in here, but if I'm African American and I'm thinking, reviewing a case, let me get my list of biases in place and think about them consciously before I even start reviewing this file. If I do that, when I see this, I automatically am priming myself to be aware of, I have an affinity, I share a race with someone in this scenario. So I have to be very intentional about not letting any subconscious biases influence the way I look at this. I need to be objective. Does that make sense? Right? Okay. The halo effect, you mentioned the halo effect. One of the...
Sorry, it was the horn effect.
Oh, the horn effect, sorry. I was thinking halo, but I actually have a horn example. So something in here, right? So that the horns effect, one particular characteristic or trait about a person can influence how you see them or perceive them overall. So there's some foul language in here, right? The person who filed the complaint used some curse words. Now, if I'm offended by that, I'm reviewing this case and I see that, and that's offensive to me, and they said it to a police officer, that may subconsciously influence the way that I see this person. This is not a good person. I don't like the language they use. It says a lot about them. They're disrespectful. They probably talk like this to other people in their lives or other authority figures. So that comment right there could be something that, for me, stands out among everything else in the report, and it can influence how I read the rest of the report or see this particular person. Okay? Mm-hmm.
On the language point too, I mean, that makes me think also of a confirmation bias potentially. When you were talking about ignoring pieces of information that don't align with the conclusion that you've already come to. For example, if I'm somebody that is, very hostile towards police officers and, very sympathetic towards people of color who often have negative interactions with police officers, I could read this fact pattern and from the perspective of Dwayne Johnson and think like, wow, they really, police officers were really in the wrong here. I've already concluded that and ignore the fact that there was swearing and things like that because they don't play into the narrative that I've already concluded in my mind. And then the other thing I was thinking too is from an expediency bias, I think that's something maybe that could potentially come into play as a commission because, for example, like I see this fact pattern, right? And it's very dense. There's a lot of information in here, right? And I could just, look for things, and it's kind of related to the confirmation bias, where, I see something, maybe a buzzword or a key fact, and that's all I'm looking for, right?
Yes.
And it's a very quick way to make a decision without really taking the time to understand factual circumstances that led to whatever the incident is.
Precisely. Yep. Any other comments on the biases? Yes, Commissioner Grosny. Mm-hmm. So now you're getting into more practice, the practice arena, right? But it's all tied together. So available information, you're thinking of information that might be helpful to get a better understanding of what actually happened in this case. So more about the neighborhood, more about the community. As far as how police officers are dispatched into a neighborhood, that is getting into practice and things beyond things beyond just reviewing a case. It could be a recommendation that comes out of it. But as far as the biases go, the availability bias, seeking out more information to have a better understanding of the case, exactly. So what we often say for review model oversight entities, you're tasked with, one of the things that you're tasked with is determining whether the investigation was fair, complete, and thorough. So if there's information that's missing, you feel like is missing, or you have a question of whether or not it was obtained in the investigation of the complaint, that is something that you might ask for. Or I don't remember the specifics of your ordinance, but most review boards have the ability to request further investigation of a case if they feel like it is not a complete investigation. Okay, so that does speak to the availability bias. But you're pointing out, the two commissioners on the end are pointing out the desire to have more information, more complete information. And not just saying, you know what, it's not here in this case, and so they must have never, it must not exist, it's not relevant. You're being intentional about, you're wondering and being intentional about obtaining that information if it in fact does exist. Okay, so good job. Yes.
I do want to add to that. I agree with that because it's important to also get the other side of the story from the gentlemen that were in the theater, because the first few lines of sentences, it's anchoring bias, right? The tendency to rely heavily on the first pieces of information you get.
Yes.
They introduce this scenario as these two individuals being rowdy, disrespectful. They kind of set the tone from the very beginning, even though that's not how chronologically it happened. And I think it's very important to, when you read a report, still ask questions and hear the other side of the story.
Absolutely. Yep.
And on that point, sorry, was someone, you go ahead. I was just gonna say that, thank you. On that point, as commissioners, I could see a situation like this, a hypothetical, coming up quite frequently when there's a dispute between a citizen and a police officer. They're probably gonna be two competing versions of events. And, somebody's experience, right? Like testimony from somebody might not be the most reliable evidence. And so as a commission, I think it's really important in terms of getting information to make decisions based on objective information
Yep.
that are not colored by somebody's individual biases, like, the perpetrator or the police officer.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, and I was actually gonna mention something along the lines as well around the Commissioner Castillo often mentioned around the objectivity, and I'm thinking already that there's a lot of this is heavy in terms of biases and in terms of how people might perceive it, but the additional information like photos of injuries about the officers and the individuals can perhaps give us a better story of how use of force was applied, how the difficulties on arresting that person. So things that can point us to more facts to allow us to kind of like piece the story together beyond the words that are here.
And when you actually get an actual case, there's going to be a lot more information. Just, this is for the sake of the exercise, so just know that. But I like the way you all are thinking, because it's telling me you got it. You're acutely aware of what to look for and what to be aware of so that your biases don't influence you. And I'll keep going back to, we all have biases, neither good or bad. It is a automatic process that our brain goes through. The key is to be aware of them, to prevent them from influencing or impacting the work that you're doing. So this is a segue into what you can do to mitigate your own biases as a commissioner. So again, I tried to focus on the work that you're going to be doing, and when I think of biases and implicit biases, the review process comes to mind the most, because you're going to be looking at a lot of information, that complaints that were filed by individuals against particular officers. And so it's quite easy, if you're not consciously and intentionally thinking about your own biases, to slip in to the unconscious way of looking at a case. And so here are some things that you can do. Some of them are very simple, but they're effective. Again, backed by research. First and foremost, acknowledge that you have biases. We all have them. If you believe that you're unbiased, you have no stereotypes, no attitudes based on groups of people or different identities, then you're not living in the real world. We all have them, so acknowledge that. Be intentional about completing tasks without bias. So when you're about to review a case, in some cases, I think it might even be helpful, just like when you're learning to drive or you're learning to play a sport. Initially, you have to be you're thinking a lot. What do I do here? How do I make this play? What in this car do I need to pay attention to? And, who else is on the road? When you start to review a case, be very intentional about thinking about your subconscious biases, making them conscious. Even if you had a sheet of paper that listed these biases that we just reviewed today, one sheet of paper that listed those with the definition, as you're reviewing a case, set that sheet right in front of you, so that you are intentional about not letting those unconscious biases influence the way you're reviewing a case. Employ system 2 thinking. So earlier we talked about system 1 thinking, and that's the automatic way that we think, right? It's automatic, split second, second nature way of thinking about things. So when you're reviewing a case, it's also a good idea to pause, take a step back, and go into system 2 thinking, which is where you're being very intentional, very rational. You're taking the time that you don't do in system 1 thinking. So the bullets under employ system 2 thinking are examples of what that intentional look at a case looks like. Avoid reviewing cases when you're tired, stressed, distracted, rushed, or in a heightened emotional state. When you're feeling any of those things, experiencing any of those things, you are more prone to let your subconscious make the decisions for you. Use processes, checklists, and matrices to guide a review. If you have a set of steps to follow, if you have a matrix as you're looking at the work in front of you, you're objectively, systematically looking at a case rather than just paying attention to certain things, just kind of a little more loosely. Avoid jumping to conclusions. Someone said that earlier, right? When you start looking at a case, I'll use this actual case, this Johnson case that you just read. We use this case when we do training on investigations and reviewing investigations. So we do a lot more with it in some other trainings. But I remember sitting in on a training when one of our board members was doing the training. And someone on a panel, as they were reading it, they were grunting, making noises, you know. So I knew they had strong feelings about whatever they were reading. And sure enough, when the discussion started about the case, some of the comments clearly showed their implicit biases about some of the characters in this scenario. They had already jumped to the conclusion that these officers were the worst people on earth. They hurt this young man, full of conclusions, without going anywhere beyond what you just read, okay? So being intentional about avoiding jumping to conclusions, right? Consider all relevant records and information, and a couple of you pointed out the existence of other information that is not included in here, and so think about that as you're reviewing cases. What other information might be helpful in order to understand everything? It might not exist, but if you don't ask about it, you won't know. Play devil's advocate. So as you're reviewing a case, similar to not jumping to conclusions, think about whatever where your line of reasoning is going to, right, as you're reviewing a case. Whatever opinions or ideas you're forming about the particular case, try to think of as many alternatives as possible that are happening in the particular case, right? Explanations for certain things happening. Keep it clean, which, again, you all brought up. Be careful to avoid your personal opinions about what's going on in a case, the individuals involved, the event, the neighborhood, the scene itself. And if you're focusing on irrelevant information or information that is not pertinent to what you're doing, it's not helpful, it's not going to be informed anymore than what you have in front of you, then don't spend time on that, okay? And then consider varying cultural norms. And this goes to cultural norms on a variety, again, of demographic or identity characteristics. Norms based on race, language, race, ethnicity, gender. It can be country of origin. And so these examples here, what are the language norms? What are the body language or physical gestures that are normative? How does a particular group or person handle conflict? That can be very different. Culturally, I come from a background on my mother's side, avoid conflict, right? It's very uncomfortable to deal with conflict. So that's going to look very different from someone who is from a cultural background where conflict is okay and they don't mind handling conflict in a particular way, which can be perceived as more aggressive, but culturally that's the norm. What's the relationship with authority in different cultures? So keeping cultural norms in mind can also be more informative about a particular interaction, right? Okay, so what can you do, or the second slide related to that. These are two very big and broad things that, again, simple things that I encourage. Identify your biases and actively challenge them. So it's helpful to have an understanding, like we know at this point, everyone has biases, but have you ever intentionally thought about what your biases are? So it could be helpful to take some time to try to identify what your biases are. And then when you recognize them or you're aware that you have them, actively challenge yourself and where those biases come from, and are they influencing how you're looking at a case? And then, of course, take advantage of any learning opportunities that you might have as a commission, as individuals, because as one of our commissioners said at the very beginning, the more you know about something, the less fearful, the less confused, the less fill in the blank that you are. The more informed, the better you can carry out your responsibilities and your mandates as a commissioner. So when you're reviewing a case file, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the more common things that you can think about, which some of you have already pointed out. Are the reports you're reviewing that are a part of the case file, are they objective and fact-based? Were all the witnesses interviewed who are involved in this complaint? And if not, was the same effort made to contact those witnesses, the ones who were not interviewed? Was all available information considered equally? Nothing was discarded because it didn't fit the narrative or the conclusion or the theory. Was there other information that would have informed the investigation that was not obtained, and were attempts made to obtain the information? So again, you all already pointed this out, right? And then finally, are conclusions and theories supported by facts and evidence as opposed to opinions, personal beliefs, those sorts of things. All right. So, questions, comments about anything we talked about tonight? All right. I don't see any hands, so thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a really good training. I think I guess had one question. I don't know about if this is ever mentioned in reports, but I only bring this up because I served on a grand jury, and one question that you were always told never to ask was, does this person have a criminal history? Because the criminal history, knowing whether or not a person has a criminal history may influence whether or not you choose to indict. But I guess the opposite is true if, if you're asking, oh, does this police officer who's involved in this case, do they have previous complaints? Because that may skew your view on that report too. So I'm wondering if the reports mention things like that, previous criminal history, because I think that's sometimes used as a tool, or maybe I'm mistaken about, this person has a previous history, criminal history, you're more likely to investigate, or is that something that's taken into consideration, or?
I can speak in generalities, but I would defer to the officers here. When you conduct internal investigations for, say, someone files a complaint about police misconduct, currently the type of information that goes into your report about that or in the investigation, would you write up the criminal history if a person has it? Would you include that in the investigation of the particular incident?
I guess my concern is that without, in a public setting like this, discussing the nature of internal affairs investigations and what they encompass.
Okay.
If I could just, that's interesting on the grand jury point. What I would be concerned about with something like that is basically making a judgment about somebody's behavior based on like propensity, which, when someone's, this is just like, thinking about it from a legal standpoint, when somebody is accused of a crime, you're not allowed to like introduce basically the fact that they've previously committed crimes as evidence to try to convince a jury that this person's guilty of whatever they've been accused of. The idea being that just because somebody's committed a crime before doesn't mean that they necessarily committed a crime this time around. And so I just think that's interesting. And it's, it's kind of a slippery slope because, people make mistakes, both people who are accused of crimes, maybe police officers that are accused of misconduct. And so it's a data point, but I don't think I think you could easily fall into a position where you're, very quickly making a biased decision about somebody that's been accused of something.
So, oh, go ahead, Commissioner.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that, and I want to get your thoughts as well regarding Dr. Parr, regarding the because our nature of our police commission is to obviously review, investigate through the oversight director, but also look at policies within the police department. And I think that for us, being able to separate that individual cases, right, and look at the case just as it is, but then wondering if that could inform our larger conversation around policy, because there's the case, but then there's patterns in policing that we can start identifying that can be an issue. So not necessarily an individual officer, but more in general, as whether it's a culture of police, whether it's things that need to be changed. Yeah, I'm wondering if because I'm wondering that because we're gonna, when we start reviewing cases, we're gonna start identifying perhaps things that we might not necessarily want to apply to each other case, but more like knowing, okay, this is something happening in general.
So yeah, so when I say I speak in generalities, one of the things I try to avoid is giving a definitive answer when it's, because there's so much variation across oversight in every oversight body. And so like we talked about yesterday, there are actually a handful that in their reports of cases that identify the officers that are involved in the complaint. Most do not do that, but there are some that do. So when it comes to reporting on criminal history, or if an officer has had previous complaints filed against them, I will just speak for what I have seen in the work that I'm doing over the past year. When I've sat in on reviews of completed cases, there was no mention of the person, if the complainant had a criminal history. There also was no mention of whether or not the particular officers who were involved in the complaint had any type of previous complaints against them. The reports, the review of the particular cases focused on that incident alone, and it did not look at the past histories. So if that information were in there, absolutely, it could influence the way you look at a case. And so just from what I've seen, it's not included. Not saying it's never included. Getting to Commissioner Pereira's point, this is something, though, that a lot of boards and commissions actually do keep track of. And you're absolutely right. If a part of what you're tasked with is also reviewing policy or patterns, then you will probably keep data. We talked about data yesterday. You will probably keep data, track data on various data points related to a particular complaints over time in aggregate, so that if you are noticing that there are a lot of complaints coming out of a particular neighborhood by a particular precinct, there may be an alert, hey, is something going on here? Might be worthwhile to take a look at, might be nothing at all, but there might be something there that we need to pay closer attention to and figure out what's going on. So cases, individual cases, I have not seen it where the histories are looked into, but good point about the patterns of fact patterns, because that's something that a lot of boards do report on over time, and it's one of the ways that they work with the police departments to figure out if there's a policy or practice issue that needs to be taken a look at and possibly changed.
So would you say, generally speaking, those are two things that we should not be taking into consideration?
When you're
Whether or not it was included, don't take that into consideration. Focus on the case itself, and don't worry about, oh, what is this cop's history? What is that individual's criminal history?
Well, see, here, I'm the social worker too. It all depends, and nothing is as easy as yes or no, do or don't. Because if someone if there's an officer who has, 20 different complaints over the matter of a few years, that may be a lot compared to the average number of complaints in that department. So that might trigger, if you're aware of that, hey, take a closer look, there might be something here. But when it comes to an individual case, again, I don't know what type of information you're going to receive, whether or not you will even have that information when you get that particular case. I don't know if the officer's name will be redacted, if it will be included. And if you do have a file where that information is in there, once you see it, how do you erase it from your mind? The best case scenario is if that information, the history on the complainant or an officer, if that is in the file, be very intentional about the biases we just talked about, how knowing that information can influence how you look at that particular case. If you're being intentional and aware that that can influence how you're looking at case, then you can be proactive about trying not to let it bias you in that particular case. I don't know how you erase something once you see it.
Just a quick thought on that, and I'm speaking in hypothetical. If the officer, for example, knew that the suspect was a felon and was in possession of a sawed-off shotgun or whatever, and they were going to arrest him and they see him leaning into his pocket to grab something, they know his criminal history. So I think for us to know what the officer knows would be helpful in assessing the situation, and that's all I had to say.
Point taken.
This question is for City Attorney, and I know Assistant City Attorney Martinez is not here, but I am curious, what is, if you could answer, what's included? I mean, I've seen complaints myself, but I'm kind of not confused about like where we are able to see or we get.
Well, generally speaking, peace officer personnel records are confidential unless they fall within the 8 categories that the legislature has exempted under the government code. So it really just depends. Each case is handled on a case-by-case basis, and each investigating officer in the Internal Affairs Unit will make a determination on what needs to be done to complete that investigation. So I can't necessarily tell you that every single internal affairs file, internal affairs case stemming from a citizen complaint is going to look exactly the same, because each investigation is unique.
And I think this is where it helps us get also clarity in terms of there's complaints that go to internal divisions from just the regular website that the police department has, but there's also complaints that are submitted to the Police Oversight Commission that are supposed to be provided to us the way that they're submitted. So I'm guessing what you're mentioning is that the ones that stem from internal affairs, they're already like going to be processed by the department. There's what's allowable, what's not. But then there's the ones that are submitted to us that we get to see. And I believe one of the questions is, officers involved that they ask of the public complaint or the description of the officer involved. So I think this is where it starts to become confusing for me. So I guess not more of a question, more of an afterthought now with this.
Any more questions, commissioners? No? Thank you again, Doctor, for another good training. I really appreciate it.
No, I'm happy to have done this. Glad to be here. Thank you.
All right, so now we move on to comments, starting with staff. Staff, do we have any comments?
Not that I'm aware of, no, thank you.
Thank you. Now we move on to commissioner comments. So I'll start to my right, Commissioner Goronsky. Closing comments.
Okay, I'll go back to what I asked to begin with. Is this the time now that I can say this? Okay. Sorry, I didn't know. But as I said, being the climate that we have in the world, especially in this country today, we all want to be safe, no matter what we're doing. Here we are helping our police department and our city to be a safer place, okay, and a better place. I would like to ask if it's possible for us to have an officer sit out there in the lobby and watch who comes in here after we're started with the meeting. We don't need shooting going on, for heaven's sakes. As we go on with more of our cases, we may get a larger crowd in here also. And I'm just asking that we could possibly have that for our own safety or anybody else that comes in here. So you sort of answered in a way that you would look into it, didn't you?
Yes, we'll make an assessment and see if it's feasible.
Okay.
And procedurally, Commissioner, is that something that you would like agendized for a vote at the next meeting?
Well, I don't understand why it has to be.
Well, if it's the pleasure of the commission to vote on something like that.
Well, if that's what it will take, okay,
Okay, we will note that for the next meeting.
okay.
Commissioner Castillo-Lawton?
I have no comments other than to say thank you to Dr. Barr again for coming out here from Virginia, I think, right? Really appreciate you being here.
Vice Chair?
No comments either, except thank you. And thank you again to staff for everything they've done for us.
Commissioner Perea?
Thank you again, Dr. Barr. I think we are very lucky to have you fly all the way over here to give us this training. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we can continue to tap into your brain in the future as the commission continues to do its work. I also want to thank Commissioner Said for the snacks. This kept me not grumpy today. And then lastly, I am for Commissioner, the point that Commissioner Goronsky mentioned. I think I'm, once it comes back to an agenda, we can discuss. I think I'm struggling a little bit with this one, just because I don't think this is a common practice in commission meetings from what I perceive from city staff. And I understand the sense of safety and security for commissioners. When I was appointed as a commissioner, or at the time with Measure X committee, which Commissioner Carpenter and I serve on, I did receive a lot of hate mail and threats because of my immigration status. But nevertheless, I came here to do, I showed up to do the work regardless. And I think I did not have a sense of needing a police officer in the chambers. It was also COVID time, so we were doing some hybrid there. But I guess I'm struggling with this one.
Commissioner Said?
You're welcome for the snacks, and thank you so much, Dr. Barr. Thank you.
Can I make one final comment?
Sure.
Typically, one of the officers will be here at our meetings, correct? So we will have a police officer on site. Thank you.
To continue with this, but if you notice, where are the officers? Our officers, right here looking at us, okay? Who's out there? We can see what's going on out there, okay? Now, these two officers don't, because they're looking this way. So somebody could come in the back and start shooting. I'm not trying to scare everybody. I read the paper, I watch the news like everybody else. You just never know. But, somebody could come in here with a gun and just go crazy like they do, and we see it first, but they have to turn around and say, oh, oops, we better do something about that. So that's my point I'm trying to make.
No, I appreciate that. It's just a question. I wasn't having a point of contention with you. So if it's going to be agendized and we vote on it, and you look into it, I was just asking that typically there will be an officer here. That was my point. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry. I just was going to continue his thought there. If you have to decide whether we all want it or not, first they have to find out whether they will allow us to have one. Isn't that correct? Sir?
It's really not up to us. As I said, I was going to make an assessment if it was feasible for an officer to be out there. That's something that we can ask council to see if that's
So if it's not feasible and they won't give us one, then there's no sense of voting, correct? Just things to think about. Think of the background, think of everything like we learned tonight. What kind of bias, attitudes do we have here? Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I was just gonna, just to play devil's advocate, it does raise the question of why police officers are present at city council meetings, but not at any other commission, like any commission meetings. I'm curious why that is, if anybody could speak to that.
So whenever we staff any type of security measures at any type of event, regardless of whether it's a council meeting, a commissioner, or a commission such as this, or an event in the community, it's all based upon threats and intelligence. So if we got information indicating that there's a need for police presence, then we provide that presence. But generally speaking, we will make in terms of what Commander Lopez said, we'll make an assessment. If for whatever reason there's an occurrence going to happen at a commission meeting that's going to warrant a heavy police presence, then we'll provide that.
Are there threats anytime that the city council is gonna meet? Like, is that a common?
No. I said that's a factor.
Oh,
That's
that's
not the
a
deciding
factor.
factor.
I
But
see.
those are things that we take into account when we decide how and what we're going to staff. Anytime you have a large gathering of people, there's always a potential for something to happen.
Thank you.
I listened to last night's meeting, and I think Assistant City Attorney Martinez said that today would mark the ending of our training. So is now the time to, I guess, looking forward for next meeting, should we encourage, I guess, to start adding things to the agenda so that we can start, looking into policies, because I don't want next month to come and there's no training, and so there's no topics. What happens now moving forward? Is it just strictly a commissioner requested items?
Honestly, I
Sorry.
can't
Okay, if-
necessarily give you
can-
direction on what to agendize. That would be something between this commission and the legal advisor in terms of what are the commission's interests in agendizing items for discussion as it relates to the duties and responsibilities under the municipal code. You wanted to say something, Commissioner?
Yeah, in terms of complaints, I believe Counselor, I don't know his last name, Jonathan Martinez. He mentioned that we would be receiving hard copies of complaints that had been submitted through the portal, and I was just wondering if we could actually receive those copies, because I haven't reviewed them personally.
Please communicate with him in that regard. I will let him know to communicate with you in that.
I guess my
So I guess I'll clarify what I'm asking. So is it safe to say that there's no training planned for next time?
I do not believe that there are any additional training sessions scheduled.
Okay.
And I just want to add that I did ask Commander Lopez to communicate with Counsel Martinez about the complaints. I don't know if you got a chance to speak with him.
I did. You missed him. He was actually still in the building after you walked out. And he made sure that he's in a meeting currently, and he made mention that he was going to come after that meeting if we were still here.
I have a couple comments, and thank you, Chair Vega, for bringing up the issue of agendas, and items. I am still confused about the agendizing process, and I will say one because when a couple of us have brought items in the past or items that we would like to see, Assistant City Attorney Martinez had mentioned to email him and to be in conversation with. But then there's the other way around where Commissioner Woronski just mentioned bringing up an item that could be agendized just from our comments, closing comments. So it's not a consistent process, and I would like us to get clarity in that, Chair Vega, so that we can actually be functioning. And then the second one, I do want to ask, has anyone actually picked up their complaints?
2 packets now, as I understand. There was another packet that came out.
So you have one physically?
I got the first packet physically, and we got, at least I got we should have all gotten an email from Jonathan that said there was another packet. He had mentioned that he would bring him to the next meeting, but he apparently forgot.
And you took it home?
Yeah, I physically went, but I have not gotten the second packet.
So this is where I feel that we need also clarity and consistency, because I showed up to pick up a packet, but instead I was taken to a room to review them, and I was not able to take them home.
Well, on that point, I do have a question. Counselor Martinez mentioned via email that we would get copies of complaints that we could take home, but that if we wanted to review unredacted versions, they had to be on site, and I'm curious about why that is.
Honestly, that's a discussion that you have with your attorney for the board, or the commission, excuse me, but you are absolutely right in the sense that the redacted complaints were provided in a manila envelope with the confidentiality provisions, and the unredacted would remain in the office for review by this commission.
And who is the attorney for the commission?
Jonathan Martinez.
That's what he told me too. That's what came on my email too, is that you can come up there and read the ones that haven't been redacted. My voice is leaving me. Or you can take the ones that come home with. Like I say, he was supposed to be here tonight too, but it's two times he's missed, so we haven't gotten him that way.
But I do want to caution that we're having a discussion about a non-agendized item. So any inquiries that you have regarding review of documentation or information that this commission is charged with and allowed to review, please speak with or email Mr. Martinez.
And
Can we make a motion for the next meeting that we have to put on the agenda the complaints that we're supposed to review, how we obtain them, and what information we should be allowed to take home with us? Can we make a motion for that?
The way I understand that, is what, like he wrote to me too, is that we can come and get the ones and take them home and read them at our leisure, or we can and then come up there and read the ones that we said that aren't redacted, that they don't want us to bring home.
Why don't we do this? Why don't we ask the commission secretary to follow the standard procedure? If there is something that this commission would like agendized, to agendize it for discussion, because I feel like we're kind of going into that discussion point that we should not be at this point, including conversations with Mr. Martinez.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
okay, so with no further business before the commission,
Well, hold on. Can we clarify about how we would get this on the agenda? What are the procedures? We have to meet
Yes.
once a month. Once a month at a minimum.
Yeah.
can I ask real quick, sorry, I'm so sorry. Closing comments, is that the proper time to request for an item to be put on the next meeting?
You certainly can request items to be agendized for the next meeting.
Just, if we can't do it during closing comment, there would be no other logical time to do it.
So how about I propose this, we go one round, and if somebody wants something specific on the agenda for next time, let staff know, and then they can determine whether or not, if they can put it on there. That way we can make it absolutely clear, especially now that we're done with training.
That's fine, but I think it would be beneficial for everybody on the commission to understand what the procedure is, because there seems to be, people seem to be kind of given the runaround when they want to get things on the agenda. And so I'm curious, one, whether there's a limit as to what we can put on the agenda. It seems like we should be able to discuss things that are within the scope of our responsibilities if we want to. I don't think, it seems weird to me that we would be prohibited from doing something like that. And so clarity on the process, specifically whether there are things that we can be prohibited from agendizing, and two, how we actually go about agendizing something would be very helpful, because this is a common concern that people have raised now for multiple meetings.
As a suggestion for next meeting for our training, maybe we could have the process and procedure for agendizing items. Would that be acceptable to everybody as a training class? Because it doesn't seem that any of us really know how it works. Can we have that as a training class? That's my question.
Commissioners, thank you for your comments. Tonight's agenda, under the section that we're discussing now, for commissioner comments, provides an opportunity for each of you to share general comments regarding the scope of your role as official commissioners on the Police Oversight Commission. I'll answer really quickly. Generally, you provide comments. We have a recording secretary who's taking minutes, and this meeting is being recorded. Once the meeting is over, our staff will review, take a look at the minutes, review and listen to the meeting, and our staff ultimately has the discretion to prepare that agenda. So our staff will take care of that. So in the meantime, you're free to make your brief general comments. We don't enter into any discussions right now during closing comments because those topics are not agendized. And our staff will follow up and we'll have an agenda ready for you prior to your next regular meeting. And if you have any other questions, doubts, concerns, I suggest that you reach out to Jonathan Martinez. You can call him, you can send him an email, or if you happen to see him here at City Hall and he's available, you're more than welcome to speak to him.
So just to clarify, staff has the ultimate discretion about what to put on the agenda?
Yes, our staff prepares all of our boards, commission, meeting agendas. There are business items, sometimes there are routine matters. So for example, the Police Oversight Commission requires that an annual report be prepared, and that was something that we spoke about yesterday. That ultimately will go on to an agenda, and that's not something that staff decides yes or no. That's something that the ordinance requires, so that goes on the agenda. Generally, staff prepares these agendas and then they're published. So that's something that our team gets to do every month.
So it sounds like we're at the mercy of staff.
Provide your comments during your commissioner comments, and our staff will follow up.
Okay, so so to avoid having going back and forth, I go back to my suggestion that we all just briefly state what we would like to see at the next meeting, but without going into conversation with each other. Commissioner Goronsky, I believe you already brought up something that you want included for the next meeting. Was there anything else? Okay, I think that was clear. Commissioner Castillo-Lawton?
I have a question. If you could, would it be possible to point us to the specific ordinance that explains what was just described by Mr. Soto?
I will re-forward you the ordinance establishing the Police Oversight Commission.
Perfect, thank you.
Vice Chair?
My comment is to make it clear, a training session for how we agendize items and what items we can agendize, and just the process and procedure, obviously following policy so we're all clear on it so we don't have this stumbling every time. Thank you.
Commissioner Pereira?
Thank you. I will also echo the similar idea, the training from Commissioner Keith. Another item that hopefully we get to see in the future will be a review of the city's sanctuary policy as it relates to the Police Oversight Commission, any items that may be relevant to that. Also looking at lexipol policies relating to sanctuary policies. I think that will be very helpful. That's my request at the moment.
Commissioner Said?
Thank you. I think I'm just going to echo what everyone else said. I think we're all really confused about procedure, and something to just highlight what the procedure is would help us all. And maybe just an update on the independent, I forgot the role. Yes, oversight director. Because I think with his or her leadership, we can all be a lot more productive. And since we're still in limbo without this person, just an update on applications that were received and or interviews if they're being scheduled. Thank you very much.
I have nothing to add other than a request. If staff determines that something that was requested here cannot make it to the agenda, if possible, we get an explanation. And I understand there are certain requests that just cannot be granted, but if it's possible, let us know why. That's the only thing that I would request.
I have another question. As to her. What is the director going to do? Why do we need a director? What's their job? What are they going to do for us?
Again, this item has not been agendized, so we can't really have a discussion about it, but the municipal code and the ordinance outlines exactly what the oversight director's role is.
Okay, so that's it for closing comments. With no further business before the commission, I hereby adjourn the commission meeting. The time is 7:03 p.m. The next meeting of the Police Oversight Commission is scheduled for September 12th, 2024 at 5 p.m.
Recording stopped.